Good evening, friends. My name is Eli Sachs. I am the director of the program in Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar with Professor Yonatan Malin on Klezmer music as Jewish dialogue and Jewish discourse. This webinar is part of our Peak to Peak series, and this is an initiative that creates conversations between CU Boulder and faculty and audiences and communities across Colorado and beyond. It's supported by CU's Office for Outreach and Engagement, and it's a partnership with communities and civic organizations across Colorado. I want to thank those communities for their support. The Corazon de Trinidad Creative District, the Garfield Public Library District, the Trinidad Carnegie Public Library, Western Colorado University, Aspen Jewish Congregation, the Boulder JCC, Kavod on the Road, and Temple Aaron in Trinidad. We're so deeply grateful for your partnership. So in a moment, I will say more about tonight's speaker. But first, I want to say a word about the music you just heard and about the program itself. So in terms of the music you just heard, that music is from the 2019 album, The Magid Chronicles, from the Klezmer trio Varetsky Pass with the clarinetist Joel Rubin. And we're going to hear more music from this album during Professor Malin's talk. We're actually also going to hear and have a conversation with two of the musicians themselves. So that's the music. Now let me say a little bit about the program itself. This webinar is a space for conversation, and this is going to take three forms. And to those of you who've participated in one of these peak-to-peak programs before, you know the routine by now. So first, after Professor Malin presents for 30-35 minutes, he and I will be in conversation with one another for about 10 minutes. And spoiler alert, we're going to be able to welcome some of the musicians who are featured in the music that we hear tonight for a conversation then. Second, we want to open things up, not just for a conversation between me and Professor Malin and the musicians, but also between you and Professor Malin and the musicians. And you can do that via the Q&A function on your screen. So if you click on that, you can write in a question. You'll see that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and your question will be visible to me, and I will try to then share it with Professor Malin and the group. And you don't need to wait to the end of the program. You can start adding those questions as they occur to you during the presentation. And finally, we want this to be an opportunity, not just for a conversation between me and Professor Malin, and not just an opportunity for a conversation between you and Professor Malin, but also an opportunity for conversations between you and your fellow participants. So right now, as many of you are doing, if you click on the chat function at the bottom of your screen, you can write a comment that will go to the group as a whole. Just make sure that you're addressing it to everyone, or it might say all panelists and attendees. During the program itself, your comments will be visible only to the presenters, but right now, if you click on that chat function, your comment will be visible to everyone. And so as I finish my introduction, I really want to encourage you, if you haven't done so, to write a greeting to the group, to say who you are, where you're from, and why you're here tonight. We are a community of learning, and community is built through these connections. Okay, none of you is here to hear me, so I want to now introduce tonight's presenter. Yonatan Malin is Associate Professor of Music Theory and Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And his research areas include klezmer, Jewish liturgical music, cantillation, and German Lieder. He teaches music in Jewish cultures, a very popular class every other year. And in 2018, he participated in our inaugural Archive Transformed residency. This was a innovative project bringing together scholars and artists founded by our late colleague, Professor David Schneer, to really foster conversations and collaborations and innovation that otherwise might not take place. And Professor Malin's participation was a great example of that. He and the klezmer fiddler Alicia Svigals joined together in that project. Professor Malin has also contributed to workshops at Yiddish New York and Klez Canada, and he was also a participant in our first Embodied Judaism Symposium honoring Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. He teaches a number of undergraduate and graduate courses in the College of Music here at CU Boulder, and his book, Songs in Motion, Rhythm and Meter in the German Lead was published in 2010 by Oxford University Press. He served as an editor of Music Theory Online, a journal of the Society of Music Theory from 2011 to 2014. And most importantly, he is here to think and learn and speak and listen with us tonight. And so please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Yonatan Malin.
Thank you so much, Eli. It's good to be here with everyone. Good evening. Happy Hanukkah to those who are celebrating. And I look forward to sharing some music and some ideas with you. I'd like to dedicate my talk this evening to the memory of David Schneer, our dear, brilliant colleague in the program of Jewish Studies who passed away earlier this fall. He was a wonderful supporter for me and for so many of us around the country. So with that in mind, I'll jump into things. I look forward to sharing some beautiful music with you this evening and some of the things that have emerged in my research. And my goal, broadly speaking, is to provide a theoretical framework for understanding klezmer music. Not so much the history and the culture of the music, although that's important as well, but the music itself, its rhythms, its melodies, and its expressive musical gestures. And I'm going to aim to do this without technical jargon in a format that's accessible to all. And so I'm going to take a moment now and just share my screen. Okay, and here we go. So let me begin with a brief definition in history, very brief. Klezmer music is Jewish instrumental music from Eastern Europe. The music was an integral part of traditional wedding ceremonies, which were elaborate multi-day events, and it was used for other celebrations and gatherings. Klezmer includes music for dancing and music for listening and contemplation. The music came over to New York, Philadelphia, and other cities with the immigrant generations from about 1880 to 1920, flourished here in the New World for a few decades, and then faded out mostly in the 1950s and 60s. Klezmer music was then rediscovered in the 1970s by a new generation in search of its roots, and the klezmer scene today is vibrant. Younger and older musicians join together to explore the tradition in new and creative ways. So I'd like to play examples for you to start out with, spanning from the old world to the new and from the early 20th century to today. I'll play them now for general familiarity so that we get the music in our ears, our mind, and our hearts. And my first example is a tune called Nakhes from Kinder, recorded in Warsaw in 1912. Let's listen. This will be about 40 seconds. So an older recording, I'm sorry the sound was cutting off a bit, but I hope you were able to get a feeling for it. My second example is a Moldavian dance tune from a collection published in 1972. I'll play here at the beginning of a 2019 recording by a hip trio of Israeli musicians led by the trumpeter Eli Preminger. And this will be in video format, and I'll pass it over now to our tech wizard, Dan Shastad, to play the video. Great, thank you. And now I'm going to turn to our third example. So I'm going to take the screen now again. And this will be a tune called So the Sparrows Will Come. It's a composition by the contemporary klezmer violinist Cookie Segelstein. And this is from their album, The Magid Chronicles, released in 2019. Sorry, coming up. So those three examples, I wanted to give you those to give a brief introduction to the really highly varied world of klezmer. What can we say about music as rich and varied as this? Each of these examples is kind of like a world unto itself. But I think a common thread emerges if we ground our theory and analysis in a cultural context, and specifically in the context of Eastern European Jewish culture and its North American offshoots. So I propose today that klezmer music is like a form of Yiddish speech, and that listening to klezmer in this way will help us understand its structure and its expressive effects. The style of Yiddish speech that I'm talking about carries over into literature in Yiddish and English, and it's sometimes referred to more broadly as Jewish discourse. Now, it might seem like an obvious approach to understand the musical language of a culture in dialogue with its literature. But music and literature are different modes of expression. Literature uses words, and words have denotative qualities. They refer to things in the world, or ideas, or people. Music is humanly organized sound with rhythm and melody. It touches our souls, but it's not necessarily about anything. Music conveys movement and feeling. It can set the scene, but it can't really tell the story. So I'm motivated nonetheless to pursue this idea that klezmer music is like a form of Yiddish speech, and I'm motivated to do so for two reasons. First, research in neuroscience has shown that there are common regions and pathways in the brain for processing music and language. Robert Yerdingen and Janet Bourne summarized the research in an article from 2015, and they write, quote, "Were we to imagine the human brain as a large apartment complex, we would find the residents named music and language living comfortably as close neighbors in the auditory wing. There they maintain separate addresses, but nevertheless share the same entrance and lobby, the ear and cochlea. They ride the same elevator, the auditory nerve, and spend time together in many of the public rooms, the ventral cochlear nucleus, the superior olivary complex, and more." And so, if there are common pathways in areas of the brain for music and language, it seems logical that musical and linguistic modes of expression would also share certain features. My second motivation comes from within the culture. And there's a common metaphor in Yiddish culture which claims that great musicians speak with their instruments, and that their music expresses their thought. The Yiddish author Sholem Aleichem described the playing of the legendary violinist Stempenu in his first novel from 1888. Quote, "Stempenu would grab his fiddle, and with one pass of his bow, just one, mind you, the fiddle would begin to speak. What do I mean, speak? I mean literally, with words, with a tongue, like, excuse the comparison, a living human being." The Soviet Jewish writer Yechezkel Dobrushin goes even further, comparing the more serious subgenres of klezmer with philosophical thought. In remarks made at the Moscow Conservatory in 1944, Dobrushin observes, quote, "This was serious music, which was played not only at weddings, but also for the tzaddik, the Rebbe. It was played for people who involved themselves with philosophical problems, and the serious music expressed their thoughts." So evidence from neuroscience and remarks by cultural insiders both support the idea that there's a connection between music and verbal discourse or thought. But what is this connection exactly? Can we explore it more deeply? And does it give clues for the theory and analysis of klezmer music? I believe it does. And I'd like to explore the connections between music and language in 3 ways. First, I'll consider the idea that passages of klezmer music may take the form of argument and dialogue, like those in Yiddish speech. Second, I will consider the idea that klezmer music has associative structures, like those in Yiddish literature. Finally, I'll show how klezmer embellishments convey emotion, like the linguistic interjections that are common in Yiddish speech. So that's the plan. Are we ready? Here we go. So let's begin with the topic of klezmer music as dialogue and argument. And I'll draw on this book here that I have on the slide by Jordan Finken. It's called A Rhetorical Conversation, Jewish Discourse in Modern Yiddish Literature. Finken observes that Jewish discourse is filled with dialogue and argument, and he connects this with religious texts, which influence the conversational style of Yiddish and its literary representation. As Finken puts it, quote, "Not only was the central text, the Talmud, a collection of disputes, arguments, and conversational refinements, but the very mode of studying it, b'chavrusa, in company, literally in pairs, was argumentative and conversational." So what does this mean for music? Here, some of the work has been done for us already. Oops, to go back. I'll share a clip from a video. Oh, sorry, go back for a moment. The klezmer musician and scholar Zev Feldman presents a klezmer tune as a dialogue and an argument. And Feldman uses the first tune that I played for you earlier, called Nakhes von Kinder. I'll share a clip from the video and then I'll comment on it. We'll see Feldman introducing a melody that he says is in a Turkish style. He then goes on to say that it becomes a dialogue, and this musical dialogue is what makes it characteristically Jewish. So let's watch. This will be about 1.5 minutes, and I'll turn it over once again to our tech wizard, Dan, to play the video.
It begins with a rather Turkish-sounding rhythm and melody. Da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-da, da-da-dum-dum, da-dee-da-da-da-da. Which is a classic sort of Chalgia, Balkan Turkish urban melody. It becomes a dialogue very quickly. So it loses, the Turkish tunes are not a dialogue. Whereas the Jewish tune is almost immediately a dialogue. So it starts da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-da-da, which is one melody. And then it goes da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-da, da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-da-dee-dum-dum, da-da-da-dum. So it's raising the tonal center, it's raising the pitch, and therefore it's giving you a new argument. Da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-dum-dum, dee, da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum.
Good. So thank you. So that was the scholar Zev Feldman. I'm going to return to my screen now. With some beautiful dancing as well in this video that he produced. Feldman demonstrates his ideas by singing, but I want to unpack them a little bit with you. He sings the tune and then he explains it's raising the tonal center, it's raising the pitch, and therefore it's giving you a new argument. But what does he mean by this, and how is it a new argument? So the effect of discourse and argument comes, I believe, from the varied repetition of a short melody. A melody can be like a musical idea. And when a melody like this repeats, it sticks in our minds and can become an object for reflection and manipulation, like an object of discourse. Here on the slide is a visual representation of the first melody with its durations and contour. It goes like this. So if I sing that and follow in the contour, ya-ba-bum-bum, ya-ba-ba-bum, just like that. Notice that there's emphasis on this pitch right here, ya-ba-bum-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum. And so we hear this idea twice, and it sticks in our minds. And then the idea repeats at a higher pitch, as Feldman explains, but it's also altered in the process. Here is a sketch of the altered idea at a higher level. It rises up at first instead of dipping down, and the emphasized pitch now is a higher one, not a lower one, like this. So following along, ya-ba-bum-bum-ba-ba-ba-bum. So it goes up here instead of going down like it did there. And while the idea is altered, it's still similar enough to be connected in a thread of musical thought. The music theorist Elizabeth Margulis has studied musical repetition from a cognitive perspective. And Margulis observes, quote, immediate repetition tends to draw listeners into an affiliative relationship with the sound. Listeners may nod along or sing through the riff mentally, attention directed at the sounds about to unfold. Gapped repetition, on the other hand, tends to spark a more explicit awareness of structure. This kind of repetition can provide listeners with identifiable landmarks that are easy to think and talk about, generating an impression of discourse. So the repetition we're talking about here is close enough to create an affiliative relationship, as Margulis describes it, drawing us in, but it is also gapped enough to create an impression of discourse. And since the repetition is varied, it also creates the impression of a new argument, as Feldman puts it, without being about anything in particular. Now, this may be a new argument, but is it a Jewish one? On an abstract level, perhaps not. The effects of repetition and variation that we find here are common in many musical traditions, including the Western classical canon, Haydn, Mozart, and so on. But the tune uses a klezmer scale, and it's played with distinctive klezmer ornaments, timing, and pitch inflections, with a Jewish accent, if you will. In these ways, it becomes a form of Jewish discourse and dialogue. And since argumentation and dialogue are particularly common in Yiddish discourse, it makes sense to use them as an analytical and interpretive lens for understanding the music. And we've done that now in the first section, building on Zev Feldman's observations about this tune, Nakhes von Kindel. So now I'm going to turn to the second topic, which is about associative structures. Association involves the free working of the mind, if you will. And associative structures don't proceed in simple, direct lines. It turns out that this is a common feature of Yiddish discourse. And here I draw on this book that I have now on the screen by Binyamin Harshav called The Meaning of Yiddish. It's a classic book. As Harshav puts it, quote, Jewish religious and moral discourse, and Yiddish conversation deriving from it, advances not in a straight line through affirmative statements, but through many kinds of indirect or translogical language, asking a question, challenging a claim, illustrating a point by telling a story, an anecdote, or a parable, quoting a holy text or a proverb, and so on. So what would an analogous form of musical discourse be, with associative rather than logical sequencing of events? We might imagine several possibilities in the abstract, situations where one musical idea leads to the next without any obvious sense of musical purpose or direction. But I'd like to draw attention to a particular feature of klezmer music, and that's the use of common endings for contrasting sections. Let me explain. In the first tune we considered, Nakhes von Kindel, we discovered a direct, logical form of musical discourse. I observed that repetition and variation combine to create the new argument that Feldman alludes to. Direct, logical forms of musical discourse generally follow the design, same beginning, different ending, which I show here on the bottom of the screen. But what happens if we reverse this design so it becomes different beginning, same ending? It would be kind of like, let me tell you about this first musical idea. Now let me tell you about this other different musical idea as well. Oh, and by the way, these two things are related. They end up in the same place. So we notice the difference first of all, but then an association is created. We can call this associative discourse. It turns out that this musical design of different beginnings, same endings, is common in klezmer music. And we'll hear it now in our second example, the Moldavian tune that we listened to earlier. So I made a kind of a bubble diagram to show how the tune is put together. It's in two sections. The top diagram here shows the first section, which I've labeled A, and the bottom diagram shows the second section, which I've labeled B. Within each section, there are 4 phrases. Those are the smaller bubbles, and I've labeled these with lowercase letters. So I know they're kind of small, but the letters here are X, B, C, and D. And then for the B section, Y, B prime, C, and D. So we see that the C and D sections at the end are the same. The X and Y are different, and the B is varied slightly there. So different beginnings, same endings. So I'll now play the A section, and you'll be able to actually follow the cursor playing along as it plays, and then I'll play the B section. Now keep that in mind, and here's the B section. All right, so there it is with the bubble diagrams, and you might have at this point a kind of general sense that they're common endings, but it's difficult to really latch onto them until you know the tune better. So I'm actually going to take a moment to teach you a little bit of the tune, and if you like, wherever you are, I'm going to play a little bit, and I'm going to invite you to sing back. So I'm going to especially teach you the C and the D sections, the sections that return, and the C section begins like this. So if we break that up, it would go, and you can sing back, ba ba da ba dum. One more time, ba ba da ba dum. Now listen. So we add a little bit more. Let's try that together. Ba 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 dum. Now I'm going to add the third little bit. Goes like this. Let's try that. Ya ba 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 bum. So if we put now all of that together, it goes ba ba da ba ba da ba 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 da 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 bum. And the ending, listen. And if we hum that together, let's try that. I'll do it twice. Ba ba da ba da ba da ba dum bum. And one more time. Ba ba da ba dum ba da ba dum bum. Okay, so now that we really hopefully got it in our ear again, let's listen again. I'm going to play a longer section from the tune. It's the A section repeating, the B section repeating, and listen for those passages that I just taught you at the end of each section. Here we go. And returning to the familiar. So that again was a trio called PRIMITIVSKY in Israel. And what is our experience of this form? In the A sections, I think we simply take in the tune. And then in the B sections, we experience something new and different, and then a return to the familiar. It's an associative kind of connection more than a direct logical one. So is this analogous to the kinds of digressions and associative effects that we find in Yiddish literature? The connection might still seem tenuous, but it turns out that Yiddish stories also have refrains, like the common endings of klezmer music. And these refrains also link the associative digressions, bringing them back to a common theme. In Sholem Aleichem's story, The Pot, a widow named Yente delivers a long episodic monologue before the Rebbe. At the end of each episode, Yente says, quote, "Yes, and how did that come up?" As Jordan Finken aptly describes it, the internal logic of Yente's monologue is associative, digressive, and oral. That is to say, it proceeds exactly the way conversations do. As each unit runs its course, the refrain brings the conversation back to a central topic. And this, I believe, is exactly what happens with the common endings in klezmer. Now I turn to the third part of my talk to consider klezmer embellishments, which are an important and distinctive part of the music. My claim will be that they convey emotion, much like the common emotive interjections of Yiddish speech. And here I'm going to draw again on Benjamin Harshov's classic book, The Meaning of Yiddish. Harshov observes that Yiddish, quote, strongly conveys the emotive attitudes of the speaker, and it does so, quote, with Hebrew, Slavic, or emotively loaded idioms and expressions, or by interposing brief words or interjections with no independent meaning of their own. So I propose that klezmer musicians do the same with their embellishments and variations. These klezmer interjections also have no independent meaning, and they're also understood to convey emotion. Let's begin with an example in Yiddish. I quoted earlier from Sholem Aleichem's novel, Stempenu, where the violinist's playing is said to be like speech. The narrator says that the fiddle would speak, and then he engages in a little dialogue. What do I mean, speak? I mean literally, with words, with a tongue, like, excuse the comparison, a living human being. Here it is in transliterated Yiddish on the left. Wie soll meint ihr reden? Take mit Wörter, mit der Zunge, wie lehavdil a lebendiger Mensch. So Sholem Aleichem's narrator doesn't just say, I mean with words, with a tongue, and so on. He says, I mean literally with words. In Yiddish, it's take mit Wörter. The added word take is not needed to convey the simple meaning. It is needed to convey emphasis and an attitude of amazement. And then the narrator doesn't just say with a tongue like a living human being. He says with a tongue like, excuse the comparison, a living human being. In the Yiddish, it's mit der Zunge wie lehavdil, a lebendiger Mensch. The added word, lehavdil, comes from the Hebrew lehavdil, which means to differentiate, and especially to differentiate between the sacred and the mundane. The word havdalah comes from the same root. Havdalah is the ceremony that marks the end of Shabbat or Shabbos and the beginning of the week. And so the connotations might be something like, look, a violin and a human being, they're as different as can be, as different as the holy and the mundane, but still the violin speaks like a living human being. So there are many little musical embellishments in klezmer performance. I was just in a workshop today with Josh Horowitz, who's going to join us in a moment, and we were working on these. And these aren't essential from a purely structural point of view. You could play the melody and still recognize it without them. But they are essential from an expressive point of view. We can say that they convey the emotive attitude of the performer, even if it's hard to put that exact emotion into words. So let's now consider a few embellishments in our third tune, Cookie Siegelstein's So the Sparrows Will Come. Siegelstein begins the tune with a melody about 30 seconds long, which he then repeats with embellishment. The two large bubbles here show the repetition. I've marked them A and A prime. Each iteration has 5 phrases marked with lowercase a through e. So let's listen first to the whole section with the repetition. A beautiful tune. I'm sorry to cut it off there, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to zoom right in and listen for some of the embellishments more closely. So here's the first phrase on its own. And here's the repetition. Were you able to focus in on those? So what I noted at the bottom, sorry about that, timeline's coming up. I noted an aside, joyful leap, and then another aside. They go by quickly. So let's listen one more time right here. So there's freedom in the moment to add these little interjections, which are like the added words in Yiddish speech, conveying the emotive attitude of the speaker. My labels, an aside, a joyful leap, are not technical terms of music theory or klezmer musicians, in case you were wondering. They are simply my improvised descriptions for the added elements. Yiddish culture embraces spontaneous emotive interjections. We have found them now in literature and in music. For my conclusion now, I'd like to conclude with just a few reflections. I suspect, or I wonder, whether this project might feel affirming or even heartwarming for some of you. It might be affirming to know and to be able to identify musical elements that can be called Jewish, whether they are facets of a musical argument, associative structures, or distinctive klezmer embellishments. Indeed, the question of defining Jewish music has been a preoccupation of scholars and musicians for a long time. It might seem like I've cracked this nut by drawing out an analogy between music and linguistic discourse. The situation isn't quite that simple. There are caveats. First, we're dealing with a very particular musical and historical context. So not Jewish music in general, but klezmer, which again is instrumental music from Eastern Europe. We haven't talked about Jewish music from the Middle East or Sephardic songs or the classic songs of the land of Israel or even contemporary American Jewish music from singers like Debbie Friedman or Nechama Karlebach. So the project is focused on a particular musical subculture, not Jewish music writ large. Even within this domain, we can't use the evidence from my talk today to define Jewish music in an exclusive sense. So, I have a secret to tell you, which is that the Moldavian tune we listened to comes from a mixed Ashkenazic klezmer and what's called a gypsy lautar repertoire, as Zev Feldman describes it. And the repertoire includes both Judaized Moldavian dance genres and Moldavianized Jewish genres. So which was this tune? We don't really know. And the Israeli trio that performed this drew as much on New Orleans jazz as on klezmer performance styles. Nonetheless, musical argument, associative structures, and emotive interjections are common in klezmer as in Yiddish speech and in literature. By exploring the music in this way, I think we can avoid the mistake of imposing music theoretical concepts that come from Western classical music onto klezmer. We consider klezmer music on its own terms and with terms that are aligned with insider conceptions. We take seriously Sholem Aleichem's description from his 1888 novel, Stempenu, quote, "The fiddle would speak. What do I mean speak? I mean literally with words, with a tongue, like, excuse the comparison, a living human being." So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the screen share now and invite Eli Sachs to join me again.
Yonatan, you talked about how there's this risk of kind of imposing kind of, let's say, Western classical kind of music framework on klezmer music. Can you say a little bit more about that? What are some of the ways in which klezmer music, Eastern European Jewish music more generally, has been misunderstood because people have brought the wrong framework to bear? What are some of the ways in which Jewish music and this klezmer heritage sort of hasn't received the attention or perspective that it deserves because we sort of haven't been thinking of it in its Jewish and Eastern European context?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that question. You know, there's a couple things kind of to say about this. It's more of, the way I perceive it, it's more of a risk than something that's happened already. That is, it's more of a danger that we just need to be careful of than that people have already done this. And the reason I say that is for a couple of reasons. One is that the discipline of music theory, which is where I'm coming from, historically has focused mainly on Western classical music. It started to bring in pop in the 1980s, and now it's really branching out to various world music traditions. But the kind of theoretical tools that have been developed in that context really are especially designed for, you know, Bach, Mozart, Haydn. Moving on from there, I mean, it's a very rich field. And so what are the dangers of you know, that we could fall into? It has to do with things that are a little bit hard to explain. It has to do with a sense of key, with a sense of harmony, certain assumptions about harmony, certain assumptions about form, that if we started looking for those, we would look at klezmer and say, they're not there, there must be something wrong. And that's clearly not the case. This music has its own idiom. I think I'll answer this with one other little kind of observation. I've been doing this taking this other approach to this music, which comes from something called schema theory, where you take these little idiomatic phrases and you look at, you know, what are the common idiomatic phrases? And that's a great way to explore klezmer. But if we were to take the idiomatic phrases that are common in 18th century Western European repertoire, you wouldn't find them. You don't find them in klezmer. They're just not the same. And so that's an example of that.
Thank you. Well, in a moment, we'll get to questions from the audience, but I want to first invite to join us two of the musicians whose work you heard featured tonight, Josh Horowitz and Cookie Siegelstein, to join our conversation now. I see Cookie and Josh there. I know, Yonatan, you and Cookie and Josh are going to be in conversation for a little, and then after a few minutes, I'll try to bring some questions to all of you from the audience.
Great, thank you so much for being here. So just so everyone knows, Cookie is the violinist who we heard in that last piece, and Josh was playing the timbal, and so they are from the trio Varetsky Pass, and it's their wonderful music that we were hearing from the end, and I've had the honor of working with them on various occasions, really enjoyed working with them. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit, any thoughts that you have.
You know, I was kind of taking notes as you were speaking. The idea of conversation and music is something that it of course transverses all styles. And when I teach my students how to make a good tone on the instrument, I tell them your fingers are the words, but your breath is the bow. So and when I wrote this tune, so the sparrows will sing, so the sparrows will come. It comes from a Dostoevsky quote that so moved me about I think it's Crime and Punishment. I get my Russian novels mixed up, but this boy is dying and he says to his father, "Father, when I die, put breadcrumbs on my grave so the sparrows will come and I'll know I'm not alone." And that was just so incredibly moving to me. And so in writing that tune, I started out with actually the second part, which wasn't played, but the second part, which was a very plaintive, simple melody. And that's how I compose. I usually, come up with a ditty or a section, and then it feels like it needs something at the beginning. So I wanted it to be very internal, the piece, very internal. And the techniques used for that, I mean, they're real specific violin techniques, tilting the bow a little bit so not much hair is on the string. And those little things that you called, I can't remember what you called it. I know the joyous lead, the aside. I love that word, the aside. I accidentally did the first one and liked it. So then after the first one, it wasn't accidental. But it really was conversational for me. It really was the idea of, especially when you repeat something, you might say it and your voice might get a little hoarse at the end. And so that's what that was. Or there might be a little kind of, I don't know what you call it when your voice, when you get to the place where your voice is too high and it kind of switches, like yodeling, whatever that is. That's what I felt about that. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd never asked you where the name comes from. That's so great to hear. Yeah, that's beautiful, very touching. Did you have anything to add, Josh? Or?
Well, first of all, I love the presentation. It's so concise and beautiful. I just it's an artwork in and of itself. Thank you for that. No, I mean, when Cookie, that little aside thing that she does, actually, it's not the only place that you do that. I mean, you kind of do that sometimes where you just do this little fall off thing, and I can really hear the little declamation that Yonatan here's there, the aside kind of thing. It's this little afterthought almost. Yeah, so, and I love the connection to the language. I mean, as far as, well, the cadence part that you noticed from the Israeli group, and that cadence that we're talking about, it's also, I just want to put another element onto that, and that is that those are really practical in that they're formulas, and the cadential formula that we use, and sometimes they're easy to improvise around. So like sometimes with my improvisation students, I'll do another structure where the cadence forms the start of the next section, and that's a very typical thing that you find in folk music, where you go, let's say A and B being the cadence, and then you'll take part of the B and it becomes the A, and then you keep stringing it along that way so that there's this memory of the last thing that just happened. And it's a really nice way to improvise, and you can almost keep it going and going and going. But I love the analysis. That I just wanted to put that as an extra element in there, that it's something that's very practical in the dance world of klezmer music, or the improvisational world of klezmer, to have these formulas intact.
Right, and this formula specifically, sorry, that's a really common klezmer formula that you have all the time in lots of different tunes. And then one of the interesting things, though, is that the part right before that is not a formula, right? It belongs to this tune. And so there's both the formula and the kind of specific thing to the tune as well. Yeah.
It's the pre-cadence kind of thing. And sometimes that's where you would start the next B section too. But this is a different format that you have right here with 3 statements and then the cadence. Yeah.
Yonatan, can I jump in with some picking up on some of these themes with some questions from the audience, sort of touching on some of these issues that are already coming up in this conversation?
Great.
So one sort of set of questions that's coming up in the audience is sort of picking up on this sort of issue that is coming up relating to the kind of nature of klezmer music, and in particular kind of the complicated question of influence and context that came up in your presentation, and that is coming up in the sort of conversations about different kind of pieces of literature, different kinds of patterns. And there are a few kinds of questions that are coming up about influence. One kind of question has to do with the kind of way in which influence works in Klezmer's original Eastern European context. A number of members of the audience have pointed out points of contact between Klezmer music and other music from that sort of Eastern European context. And so one question here is sort of what's the direction of the influence here? How much is this a case of Klezmer music bearing the trace of the sort of influence of its broader Eastern European context? And how much is it the case that Klezmer music is itself shaping its Eastern European context? So that's one kind of question about influence. And a related question is not just about influence in its kind of original Eastern European context, but its influence going forward. What are the kind of contemporary forms of music that are not Klezmer, but that show the influence of Klezmer? How does Klezmer's influence extend beyond itself? So I was wondering if any of you wanted to reflect on either of these questions about sort of the question of influence in Klezmer's Eastern European context, but also the question of influence kind of in our moment today and kind of the role of Klezmer in music today.
I think I'll just talk very briefly because I want to give Cookie and Josh a chance to answer this as well. They've been involved with this music much longer than I have. So my understanding of the influence in Eastern Europe is that it goes both ways, and that both were happening. The musicians were playing together. Jewish musicians and non-Jewish musicians were playing together, playing both for Jewish audiences and for non-Jewish audiences, and the influence really went both ways. And so that's the answer to that. And I know Cookie has stories of that from her family, and that's why I want to turn it over to you in a moment. In terms of what Klezmer music has influenced, it's now been, since it came to the New World, it's kind of been blended with so many different genres, starting out with jazz in the 1930s and 40s, and then, more recently, there's funk, there's rock, there's lots of different influences that start to come into play. To what extent Klezmer itself has influenced other traditions, that's a little bit harder to say. Klezmer itself becomes, the boundaries are porous because lots of people do many different things with it. But it certainly, Klezmer itself kind of has absorbed many influences, here in what we sometimes call the New World. But yeah, pass that on to either one of you.
Well, it's so interesting that, what makes something Jewish, right? What makes something Jewish? And I should let Josh say this because he always says, why do you need to know? We actually had that exchange with an audience member, and he's, of course, smiling so they know he's not being a jerk. But the question is, the answer oftentimes is with a listener. So what feels Jewish to one person may feel less Jewish to other people. Now, in Veretsky, where my father is from, the Klezmer band was made up of a mix of nationality. I mean, the leader was a Jewish fiddler named Mendel Haskell, and he had a varying array of musicians that played with him, sometimes Jews, oftentimes what my father called gypsies. And because Veretsky was surrounded by Poland and Hungary, had many ethnicities in that tiny area, he said there was a Ukrainian trumpet player and a Ukrainian trumpet player sometimes, and a Hungarian bass player sometimes. So it varied. The constant was Mendel Haskell. He was always leading the band. But yes, they played for Hungarians, the dignitaries, they played for Jews. They all knew each other's music. And what's interesting, as a musician, much less of a scholar than my husband, I know that when I hear a fabulous musician, I want to play with them. And I'm going to come away with a tune from them. I'm not going to worry about where it came from. I'm just going to put it in my repertoire somewhere. And that was very much the case in that area, that the music was very promiscuous, as Josh says. Musicians heard something, they liked it, they made it work for, the functions they were playing. So it's really hard to say which came first, the chicken or the egg. I think that I hear Klezmer music. My son is a rock and roll guitar player. He has a job, but for a while there, he was touring with his band that was out of Seattle. And I heard all kinds of modes in his riffs. I said, that's the Klezmer modes or the Turkish modes. He goes, no, Mom, it's metal. But in real life, some of the rock and roll riffs that you hear are very similar to some of the Turkish makam, the modes that he grew up with, hearing, whether he wanted to hear them or not. So there's no question that, we all influence each other. I know Josh wants to.
Oh, no. No. Well, I mean, when somebody asks that question, it's like, why do you want to know? And I don't mean it to be a smart aleck, but the question of what's Jewish in it or is it Jewish is packed with kind of a background of needing it to be Jewish, oftentimes. And if we recognize that, I think it's important because it's too simple a word to describe the vast array of things that are happening in music to say, is it Jewish or not? And we make the mistake often of going, oh, this is a Jewish tune and that's a Romanian tune, when they're actually sharing the same thing and playing them in slightly different ways or in vastly different ways. So we're often looking to contours and gestures in the music to determine what culture it's coming from, and you can get lost in that sea because it's such a shared repertoire. When we get down to things, there are just too many tunes that are shared, both Klezmer, Romanian, Ukrainian, all straight across the board. We have recordings to prove that and everything, but there are differences. And strangely, if you looked at the aesthetic of musicians that were playing, let's say around 1912 with Belf, and you said, oh, that's a Jewish band, and you compared those same tunes to the way that they're being played today, whether they're traditional bands or modern bands, you will not have the same aesthetic anymore. Therefore, that aesthetic cannot be called to be Jewish, or even if it was then, it certainly isn't anymore. And so we run into all these rabbit holes with trying to do that. But the basic answer is that it's very much a shared world of both repertoire and techniques also, but there are distinct differences too, and those differences change through time. And they've changed, just as you just showed in this example of the modern, the Israeli band. They're not playing it like a Rome band would in Moldova, and they're not playing it like a klezmer band played it in 1927 either. They're playing it in a different way, so their aesthetic has changed. So what's the same? What's the Jewish part of it? Is it the cadence? Well, that cadence, we find it in fanfara bands too, something like it. So, that are not Jewish. So we really, I didn't answer the question. I'm just saying how difficult it is to answer it. But that's the end of that.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have time for maybe kind of one more question. And, we had that wonderful moment, Cookie, where you talked about you and Josh challenging one another on stage and trying to make sure that everyone smiled to indicate that they weren't trying to be obnoxious, or they didn't take it as I forget the direction of not obnoxiousness, but there was some kind of effort at not obnoxiousness. But I want to try to sort of conclude by kind of running the risk of going down that route, but inviting a sort of reflection on that kind of artistic scholarly collaboration that we talked about earlier, that has been so important to, I know, all of your work, that was so important to the Archive Transform project established by our late colleague David Schneer. Cookie, when you were in your first kind of exchange with Yonatan, you talked about how some of the phrases that Yonatan used were different from phrases you had used. They were different from ways you had been thinking about the music. And I was wondering if, and we're getting questions about this as well, if you would all be able to reflect a little bit on what it's like to have this conversation between scholars and artists. Cookie, Josh, what do you hear in Yonatan's comments that resonate with you? What do you hear that maybe don't resonate with you or seem different from how you think about things? And Yonatan, how do you understand these kinds of conversations between scholars and artists? What happens for you when someone like Josh or Cookie says, look, this really resonates with me? And what happens when they say, that's not how I think of it? I guess I'd love to sort of conclude by really asking all three of you to sort of think a little bit about what it means for us to be in conversation as a scholarly artistic community.
Okay, I'll go first. It's interesting. One thing, when Yonatan, I loved everything he said. And when I, wrote that piece, and when I compose anything, I'm educated. I have a master's degree in music. I took music theory, I just didn't pay attention. So I have the knowledge, but it doesn't, for me, the compositions are very physical, and it's like my hands do it before I know what's happening. What I really liked is the idea of the repetition of the phrase. And, I hadn't thought of it this way, of having those little, the aside. I mean, I love that. I'm going to totally use that. I'll credit you for sure. But I love that idea because it's such a little gesture that I didn't even think anyone would notice. And for me, it's a very expressive, it's almost like you're running out of breath when you're saying something, which I really liked. But one thing I just wanted to ask, and maybe, Yonatan, you have more of the video of Zev Feldman. He said the Jewish version is a conversation, but the Turkish is not. So that's something I don't quite. I think a Turkish musician may take issue with that. I think that the Jewish conversation in music doesn't need to be as fancy as other conversations. It can be conversive in smaller increments. And that's how I would take that statement to be. I know that, for instance, when I was younger and my father was teaching me the tunes he wanted me to play by yelling. I mean, I loved my father, but his teaching skills were not great, so I learned really quickly so his voice wouldn't get higher. But when I would play something too fast, he'd say, "What are you, a gypsy?" And what he told me was that in Veretsky, if the gypsy musicians, the children of the gypsy musicians or the students would play too slow, they'd say, "What are you playing so Jewish for?" So for me, that told me that the sensibility of Jewish music does not need to be as ornate or as fast. It can be much more internal. So.
Yeah, great. I'm not, Zev is a scholar of Turkish music, and so he knows much more about it than I do. I think my guess is that he's picking up on something about the structure of the music. We'd have to dig into that deeper. He doesn't talk anymore about Turkish music in that particular video. But that's a great question. The video is available online if people look up Zev Feldman. And then look up videos. You'll come to it fairly soon. It's about a 20-minute video, and has some beautiful other remarks about dialogue. And so, but to pick up on Eli's question, for me as a scholar, I just as a music theorist, just working with the notes doesn't interest me. I have to feel them musically, right? And so how do I do that in a true and authentic way? I have to go and study with people like Josh and Koki and Alicia Svigels and other people, so that I know that what I'm talking about is relevant. And so that's why it's so important to me. And hopefully, I have something to add to the conversation, through reading, through thinking, and that's kind of how I look at it. And Josh himself is a music theorist, so the two of us kind of get together and put our heads together on hardcore music theory. And Josh has taught me a lot about theory of Klezmer.
Oh, right back at you. I mean, I've learned so much from Yonatan, and to me, it's not his perspective is an addition to what I know or think about. So this perspective I hadn't thought about before, and I love it. I mean, if there's any kind of discrepancy, it certainly doesn't happen with Yonatan because he's also a practicing musician. I think the issue comes up when you have theorists who really don't know the practice, and I know this happened, for instance, at the Cairo conference of Makams, is that they were the practical musicians were not invited into the fold of the theorists, and they're like, we know Makam from the inside out. What you guys are saying is coming from the outside. So that does happen with theorists, where you go, gee, give a really crude example. No. Phragish is not the fifth mode of harmonic minor. Sorry, that's great. You can see it that way. There are comparisons. It's its own mode, and there are ways that are where it's different. And if you put it in this classical framework, and you're talking about it as such, and you leave out all of the things that a practicing musician would know about this mode and even be able to talk about, you're really cutting it short. And that sometimes happens with theorists. It doesn't happen with Yonatan. But I've run into that before with other musicians where you're like, oh my gosh, can't even talk to you because you don't really know. But we're not snobs about it. I mean, mostly we use theory. It's like applied music theory. We love to use to have theory, but for me, it's always got a practical aspect to it. And this may not, but I love this way of looking at it that Yonatan is saying in the interconnections.
Eli, there's one question about a bibliography, and I'm happy to provide a bibliography. Maybe we could put it on the webpage after. Would that work for you?
Absolutely. What we can do is we can put it on our website, and you can email us if you'd like that as well. We will make sure to get that out. I wish we could continue the conversation, especially because the theme that's come up just now is conversation and collaboration. Unfortunately, we have hit the end of our time. I want to thank Yonatan for this wonderful presentation. I want to thank Cookie and Josh for joining this presentation and for kind of modeling this really wonderful kind of dialoguing conversation. Before we end, I just want to offer a few quick thank yous and mention about a few words about some other programs that we have coming up. So many people made tonight's program possible. I've already mentioned all of our wonderful partners in outreach and engagement, all of our partner civic organizations across Colorado and beyond. We've thanked Josh and Cookie. A few other thank yous to Varetsky Pass and clarinetist Joel Rubin for that beautiful music we heard at the beginning, to our tech wizard, Dan Shostad, whom none of you have seen tonight, and that's a sign of just how much of a tech wizard Dan is, to Linda Park, the program manager for Jewish Studies, and to Bryn Tully, a Jewish Studies student who is an intern who's been working behind the scenes to make this program possible. We're so grateful for all that you have done. We have a few other programs coming up this spring that I would just like to make sure you all know about. We're going to be hosting a series of programs relating to race and Jewish studies. This will begin with our annual International Holocaust Remembrance Day programming in January, where we'll be welcoming Professor Willa Johnson from the University of Mississippi to think about a variety of questions relating to race and the Holocaust. This will then continue with our annual Sandra and Howard Bender Visiting Scholar program in March this year. We'll be welcoming Professor Bruce Haynes from the University of California, Davis for a presentation entitled Judaism and the Black Experience. These won't be our only spring programs. We will have our annual collaborative program with CU Anschutz's Center for Bioethics and the Humanities. Our topic this year is Then and Now, Genocide, Courage, and Complicity. And we will have more peak-to-peak webinars as well. Our next one will be with my colleague, Professor Rebecca Ortel, on the topic Better Widowed Than Married, Conversa Women in Early Modern Europe. So we're looking forward to all of those programs. As Yonatan is pointing out, a recording of this program will be available on our website over the coming weeks. You can see recordings of all of our other programs on our website as well. And I just want to conclude by thanking all of you for joining. We know that you have many Zoom options out there. We're all suffering from Zoom fatigue, and it's such a privilege and an honor to be able to build a community of learning with you, right? This is a time where it's all too easy to feel distant, to feel isolated, and to be able to come together, to learn together and think together and grow together is really just a tremendous joy.